I was adopted when I was 4 years old enough to remember the smell of disinfectant in the hallway of the agency, old enough to remember clutching a plastic dinosaur with one eye scratched off, old enough to understand that my life was being handed over to strangers who smiled too widely and spoke too softly. They told me I was lucky. Everyone told me that. Lucky to be chosen. Lucky to be saved. Lucky to be taken in by a wealthy American family who lived in a house so big my footsteps echoed for the first year. What no one ever said out loud, but what I learned very quickly, was that luck came with conditions. My adoptive parents, Richard and Elaine, made sure I had everything that could be bought. Private schools, brand-name clothes, tutors, summer camps, orthodontics, college funds discussed at the dinner table as if they were casual purchases. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. Inside the house, though, there was a constant, low-grade reminder that I was a guest who had overstayed his welcome. They never outright said they regretted adopting me. They didn't have to. It was in the way Elaine would introduce me to her friends as our adopted son, with a brief pause before the word adopted, just long enough to make it land. It was in the way Richard corrected me when I said my parents instead of my adoptive parents, especially in public, his voice sharp with embarrassment rather than anger. Family dinners were the worst. We ate together every night at exactly 7, seated at a long wooden table that could easily fit 12 people, though it was usually just the 3 of us. The food was always excellent because Elaine prided herself on that, but the atmosphere was tense in a way that made swallowing difficult. Conversation was less about connection and more about evaluation. How were my grades? Why wasn't I top of the class? Why couldn't I apply myself the way they expected, given all the opportunities they provided? If I ever tried to talk about my day in a way that didn't involve achievements, the subject would be redirected or shut down entirely. When I was younger, I didn't understand why I felt like I was constantly auditioning. As I got older, I realized I was being measured against an invisible standard I could never meet because I was never supposed to be there in the first place. They never let me forget that I wasn't really theirs. Sometimes it was subtle, like Elaine saying things like you probably get that from wherever you came from when I did something she didn't like. Sometimes it was blunt, like Richard reminding me during arguments that they took me in, that they didn't have to, that plenty of kids never get adopted at all. The unspoken message was always the same. I owed them. For the house. For the education. For the life. Gratitude wasn't just expected, it was demanded, and any hint of frustration or sadness on my part was treated like a personal insult. I learned early how to make myself smaller. I learned which topics were safe and which ones would earn a cold look across the table. I learned to apologize even when I didn't know what I had done wrong. At school, teachers praised me for being polite and mature. Friends told me how lucky I was. No one saw how tense my shoulders were all the time, how I waited for the inevitable comment that reminded me I was temporary, conditional, replaceable. I didn't rebel because I was terrified of confirming every negative assumption they had ever made about me. Instead, I tried harder. Better grades. More extracurriculars. Less trouble. More silence. Despite everything, I kept showing up. To dinner. To family events. To holidays that felt more like obligations than celebrations. Part of me held on to this stubborn, irrational hope that if I just stayed long enough, if I proved myself enough, something would shift. That one day Elaine would introduce me without that pause. That Richard would say my son without correcting himself. That the word adopted would stop being a qualifier and start being just a fact, neutral and unremarkable. I wanted to belong so badly that I convinced myself endurance was the same thing as love. There were moments, small and rare, that fed that hope. A hand on my shoulder after a good report card. A brief smile across the table when I did exactly what was expected of me. Those moments kept me coming back even as the larger pattern never changed. Every compliment was paired with a reminder of how easily it could be withdrawn. Every kindness felt transactional. I existed in a constant state of waiting, always bracing for the next reminder that this life, comfortable as it was never fully mine. By the time I reached adulthood, the dynamic was so ingrained that it felt normal, even as it hollowed me out. I could sit through entire dinners nodding at the right moments, responding with carefully measured words, all while feeling completely detached from the people across from me. Still, I showed up. I kept hoping that time would soften them, that shared years would eventually outweigh blood, that the sheer fact of my presence would earn me a place that wasn't marked with an asterisk. I didn't realize then that some families don't change, no matter how much you give them, and that waiting for acceptance can become its own kind of trap when the people you're waiting on have no intention of ever offering it. The restaurant was one of those places where everything was designed to remind you that you didn't belong unless you could afford to. Low lighting, white tablecloths so crisp they looked starched into submission, waiters who moved like shadows and spoke in quiet, respectful tones. We were there to celebrate my sister's latest business win, another promotion stacked neatly on top of a career that had always been paved smooth in ways mine never was. She was seated at the center of the long table, perfectly composed, laughing easily, soaking up congratulations as if this was the most natural thing in the world. I arrived a few minutes late because parking downtown was a nightmare, and when I walked in, the first thing I noticed was how everyone else already looked settled, comfortable, claimed. I stood there for a moment, scanning the table, trying to find my place, even though I already knew how this usually went. There was one empty chair near the end, half tucked under the table, close enough to be technically included but far enough to be ignored. I reached for it, the leather cool under my fingers, and that was when my sister looked up at me. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't hesitate. She smiled, wide and sharp, and said loudly enough for the entire table and several nearby diners to hear, "Find another table, this one's for real family." The words hit the room and seemed to hang there, thick and heavy, as if even the air needed a second to process them. Then came the laughter. Not nervous laughter, not awkward laughter, but genuine amusement, the kind that comes easily when you're certain you're on the right side of the joke. Someone snorted. Someone else shook their head like this was classic family humor. A waiter paused mid-step, eyes flicking between us before he looked away, pretending he hadn't noticed anything at all. I didn't laugh. I couldn't. I just stood there, one hand still on the back of the chair, my body locked in place as if my brain had temporarily disconnected from my legs. My face burned, heat crawling up my neck and into my ears, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of everything, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversations from other tables, the faint smell of expensive wine and seared meat. It felt like the room had narrowed, like everyone was watching even if they weren't, like I was 12 years old again being corrected at the dinner table for forgetting my place. My sister didn't look embarrassed. She looked pleased. This was her moment, and she had just claimed it fully, pushing me out of the frame with a single sentence. My parents didn't say anything. My adoptive father glanced down at his plate as if studying the arrangement of food required his full attention, and my adoptive mother smiled thinly, lifting her glass in a small toast to my sister, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Their silence was louder than the laughter. It was confirmation, not just of what my sister had said, but of what I had known for years and still somehow managed to hope wasn't true. I wanted to say something. Anything. I wanted to remind them that I had been invited, that I had rearranged my schedule to be there, that I had bought a gift I couldn't really afford because that's what you do for family. The words crowded my throat, sharp and desperate, but none of them made it past my lips. Challenging her would have only made things worse. I had learned that lesson early. If I protested, I would be told I was being sensitive, dramatic, ungrateful. The joke would become my reaction, not her cruelty. So I stood there, frozen, feeling smaller by the second, while the conversation rolled on without me. Someone asked my sister about her next project. Someone else ordered another round of drinks. The chair I had reached for was pulled in slightly, as if to erase the possibility that I might sit there after all. I let my hand drop to my side, fingers curling into my palms so tightly my nails dug into my skin, grounding me in a way nothing else could. Eventually, a waiter approached, his voice careful, asking if I was joining the party or waiting for someone. I looked past him at the table one last time, at the people who had shaped my life while never fully accepting me into it, and I realized how absurd I must look, standing alone in the middle of a luxury restaurant like an extra who had wandered onto the wrong set. I shook my head, muttered something I don't even remember, and stepped back, letting the noise and warmth of the dining room fade as I turned away. Walking out felt surreal. Each step was heavy, deliberate, as if I were moving through water. No one followed me. No one called my name. The door closed softly behind me, muffling the laughter, and for a moment I just stood on the sidewalk, the cool night air hitting my face, my chest tight with a mix of humiliation and a dull, familiar ache. I had spent years hoping that if I showed up enough, if I stayed long enough, I would eventually earn a seat at the table. Standing there alone, excluded so publicly and so casually, it became impossible to ignore the truth I had been avoiding for most of my life. I had never been meant to sit there at all. I told myself I could brush it off, that I had survived worse moments than this, that a single sentence spoken too loudly in a restaurant full of strangers didn't have the power to define me, but no matter how I tried to frame it in my head, the message was impossible to ignore because it wasn't new, it was simply louder than usual. I wasn't loved. I was tolerated. I was allowed to exist on the edges as long as I didn't demand space, attention, or recognition, and the second I did, I was reminded of my place. Walking back home that night, every step felt heavier than the last, not because of what my sister had said, but because of how easily everyone else had accepted it as truth. I replayed the scene over and over, searching for something I might have misunderstood, some hidden context that made it less cruel than it felt, but there was nothing to reinterpret. It had been deliberate. It had been public. It had been met with laughter and silence in equal measure. That combination hurt more than outright hostility ever could, because it confirmed that my exclusion was not a secret or an accident, it was an open, shared understanding. I had been fooling myself for years by believing that endurance and obedience could eventually turn into affection. The more I thought about it, the more moments from my past lined up into a pattern I could no longer deny. Birthdays where my gifts were practical and impersonal, while others received thoughtful surprises. Holidays where family photos were taken after I had already stepped away. Conversations that paused when I entered the room, then resumed as if I hadn't. None of it had ever been dramatic enough to point to an isolation, but together they painted a very clear picture of where I stood. I was included in logistics, not in love. I was part of the schedule, not part of the bond. The only face from that night that stayed with me, the only one that didn't blur into indifference, was my grandmother's. She had been sitting slightly apart from the rest of the table, her hands folded in her lap, watching everything unfold with an expression I had seen many times before but never fully understood until then. When my sister spoke, my grandmother's smile faltered, just for a moment, and her eyes dropped to the tablecloth as if she couldn't bear to witness what had been said. She didn't laugh. She didn't raise her glass. She didn't look away in embarrassment like my parents did. She looked ashamed. It was a quiet, painful kind of shame, the kind that settles deep in the shoulders and softens the eyes. She met my gaze briefly, just long enough for me to see the apology she never said out loud. There was no grand gesture, no attempt to stop what was happening, but in that brief moment of eye contact, I felt something I hadn't felt from anyone else at that table: recognition. She saw me. She saw the cruelty for what it was, and she knew it was wrong. That knowledge didn't fix anything, but it mattered more than I wanted to admit. Growing up, my grandmother had always been different with me in small, understated ways. She remembered my favorite foods. She asked about my interests and actually listened to the answers. When the rest of the family spoke about me as an obligation, she spoke about me as a person. I used to think that was just her being kind, that it didn't mean anything beyond her general warmth, but standing there in that restaurant, feeling stripped of dignity in front of everyone, I realized she had been quietly resisting the family narrative all along. That made everything hurt more, not less. Knowing that at least one person understood how wrong this was forced me to confront how normalized the rest of it had become. If shame was possible, then this wasn't just my sensitivity or my imagination. It was real. It was ongoing. And it had been allowed to continue because it was convenient for everyone else. I had spent so much energy minimizing my own pain to keep the peace that I had stopped trusting my instincts altogether. By the time I reached my apartment, the adrenaline from the humiliation had faded, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion. I sat in the dark for a long time, replaying my grandmother's expression in my mind, the only human response in a room full of people who were supposed to care about me. I realized then that brushing it off wasn't strength, it was self-erasure, and that toleration, no matter how comfortable it looks from the outside, is a poor substitute for love. The night dragged on in a way that felt almost intentional, as if time itself had decided to participate in my humiliation, stretching every minute just a little longer than necessary. Conversation flowed easily around the table, but never toward me. My sister dominated the space with stories about her deals, her connections, the numbers she casually dropped as if they were party tricks rather than people's annual salaries. Every success was met with admiration, every exaggeration encouraged, every humble brag rewarded with laughter and raised glasses. The wine kept coming, bottles chosen without looking at prices, and the food orders became more indulgent with each round, appetizers no one finished, entrees that were barely touched, desserts ordered simply because they could be. I tried, more than once, to join in. I commented on a project someone mentioned, asked a question about a trip being discussed, even made a small joke at one point that would have landed easily in any other setting. Each attempt vanished into the air like I hadn't spoken at all. No one responded. No one even acknowledged that sound had come from my mouth. It was a strange, unsettling experience, realizing in real time how invisible a person can become while sitting right in front of others. I wasn't interrupted or talked over. I was simply ignored, which somehow felt worse, because it required a collective decision, conscious or not, to treat me as if I didn't exist. As the hours passed, I stopped trying. I focused on small, grounding details instead, the way condensation slid down the side of my water glass, the low hum of conversation from other tables, the soft clatter of cutlery against porcelain. I watched the waitstaff move with practiced efficiency, clearing plates, refilling glasses, offering polite smiles that felt more genuine than anything happening at my own table. I wondered briefly what they thought, watching one person sit in silence while everyone else laughed and leaned toward each other. Maybe they thought I was shy. Maybe they thought I was bored. Maybe they didn't think about me at all. My grandmother tried once to pull me back in, asking me a quiet question about work, but her voice was swallowed by the louder conversation before I could even answer. She gave me a small, apologetic smile, and then she too fell silent, her hands folded again, her presence subdued. It struck me then how power worked at that table, how easily some voices dominated while others were erased, and how long I had been accepting that imbalance as normal. When the bill finally arrived, it was placed squarely in the center of the table, thick and heavy, its leather cover signaling the end of the evening. Suddenly, it was as if a switch had been flipped. The energy shifted. My sister leaned back in her chair, stretching, announcing loudly that this had been such a great night and that everyone deserved to celebrate properly. My adoptive father glanced at the total and let out a low whistle, half amused, half impressed, before joking about how success clearly had its perks. That was when eyes finally turned toward me. It was subtle at first, a pause in the conversation, a few sideways glances, then my sister looked directly at me for the first time all evening and smiled again, that same sharp, knowing smile. She remarked that since we were all family here, it only made sense for everyone to contribute. The implication was clear without being spoken outright. I had been invisible when there was nothing to gain from my presence, but now that there was a financial obligation to distribute, I suddenly existed again. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the old reflex kicking in, the urge to comply, to smooth things over, to prove that I was grateful for being included at all. Years of conditioning rose up at once, reminding me how often my value had been measured by what I could provide rather than who I was. My hands rested in my lap, clenched, as I stared at the bill, the numbers swimming slightly in front of my eyes. No one asked whether I had enjoyed myself. No one acknowledged that I had spent the entire night on the periphery. The expectation was silent but absolute. In that moment, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I wasn't invited to be part of the celebration. I was invited to help pay for it. The realization settled heavily over me, not with shock, but with a dull sense of inevitability. This was the role I had been given long ago, the convenient extra, the obligation, the person who was tolerated as long as I didn't disrupt the balance and was useful when needed. The laughter, the bragging, the expensive orders, all of it had flowed freely without me, and now, as the night drew to a close, my presence was suddenly required again, not for connection, but for contribution. I looked around the table one last time, at the people who had spent hours pretending I wasn't there, and felt something inside me finally settle into place. The invisibility hadn't been accidental. It had been the point. The waiter didn't hesitate when he set the check down, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about how this had been arranged, because he didn't place it in the middle of the table or slide it toward my adoptive father, he placed it directly in front of me with a practiced, neutral smile, as if this had been decided long before the leather folder ever touched the tablecloth. The weight of it felt disproportionate, like something physical had been added to the space between my hands and the table, and for a moment I just stared at it, the neat columns of numbers blurred together, my brain lagging behind what my eyes were already trying to process. My sister noticed immediately, of course she did, because this was the moment she had been waiting for all night, and she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, smiling at me in a way that looked warm to anyone who didn't know her. She said, lightly, almost playfully, that I was paying to give back to the family, like this was some noble opportunity she was offering me rather than a demand dressed up as generosity. The words "give back" echoed in my head, sharp and absurd, because they carried the same implication I had heard my entire life, that I was in debt simply for existing in this family, that everything I had ever been given came with an invisible price tag I would never fully pay off. I finally looked down at the total, and my stomach dropped when I saw it was over $3,000. The number sat there calmly, unapologetic, reflecting the excess of the night, the expensive wine, the multiple courses, the celebratory indulgence that I hadn't been allowed to participate in but was now expected to fund. It was more than my monthly rent. It was more than I had budgeted for anything remotely optional. My heart started pounding, not just from the shock of the amount, but from the certainty that everyone at the table already knew exactly what they were doing. No one looked surprised. No one questioned it. My adoptive father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing an expression that suggested this was reasonable, even fair. My adoptive mother glanced at the bill briefly and then at me, her lips pressed together in a tight line that could have been read as sympathy by someone who didn't recognize it as disapproval at the possibility of resistance. This was the moment I was supposed to perform gratitude, to prove once again that I understood my role, that I was willing to sacrifice comfort and security to maintain the illusion of belonging. I felt heat rising in my face, a mix of embarrassment and anger, but the anger was unfamiliar in its intensity, simmering just beneath the surface rather than flaring and burning out like it usually did. I thought about the entire night, about being told to find another table because this one was for real family, about being ignored every time I spoke, about sitting in silence while everyone else celebrated. I thought about how none of that mattered now, because my value had finally been identified in a way that was useful to them. The realization was nauseatingly clear. I hadn't been excluded by accident. I had been sidelined so I could be leveraged. My sister tilted her head slightly when I didn't respond right away, her smile tightening just enough to communicate impatience, and she added that it was only fair, considering everything the family had done for me over the years. That sentence landed harder than anything else she had said, because it carried decades of history with it, every reminder of my adoption, every subtle and not so subtle suggestion that I was lucky to be here, that I owed them for the life I was living. It reframed the bill as a moral obligation rather than a financial one, turning refusal into betrayal. I glanced down the table, my eyes briefly meeting my grandmother's again, and she looked stricken now, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. She looked at the bill, then back at me, and in her eyes I saw the same shame from earlier, now mixed with worry. She knew what this amount meant. She knew what it would cost me, not just in money, but in dignity, and she also knew she didn't have the authority in this family to stop it. The silence stretched, uncomfortable now in a different way, and I became acutely aware of how public this still was, how other diners could probably see the tension, even if they couldn't hear the words. I imagined what it must look like from the outside, a family finishing a lavish meal, the youngest member hesitating over the bill, perhaps being teased. No one would guess that this hesitation wasn't about money alone, but about the crushing familiarity of being reduced to a resource. My hands trembled slightly as I rested them on the table, and I realized how conditioned I was to comply, how my first instinct was still to apologize for the inconvenience I was causing by not immediately reaching for my card. Years of swallowing discomfort had trained me well. But something about seeing that number, about hearing my sister frame it as giving back, broke through the automatic response. It forced me to confront the reality that this dynamic wasn't just emotionally damaging, it was exploitative. I didn't feel dramatic or impulsive in that moment. I felt painfully clear-headed. This wasn't about celebrating my sister. It wasn't about family. It was about reinforcing a hierarchy where I existed at the bottom, useful when needed, disposable when not. Paying that bill wouldn't buy me acceptance or respect. It would only confirm that this treatment was acceptable, that I agreed with the version of myself they had constructed. As I sat there, staring at the check placed so deliberately in front of me, I understood with a certainty that left no room for denial that this was never going to change, no matter how many dinners I attended or how much I tried to earn my place. The price of being tolerated had just been made explicit, itemized down to the cent, and it was far higher than any amount of money. I couldn't afford it, not even close, and that fact sat in my chest like a weight as heavy as the bill itself, but no one at the table asked whether I could, because the answer didn't matter to them. The pressure started quietly, in the way it always did, with carefully chosen words and familiar phrases that had been used on me for years. My sister reminded me again of how lucky I was, drawing out the word as if it were a gift she personally had given me, lucky to have been adopted, lucky to have grown up in comfort, lucky to have opportunities one supposedly never would have had otherwise. Each repetition stripped a little more air from my lungs, Because luck was never used as kindness in this family, it was used as leverage. My adoptive father added that this was the least I could do, given everything they had invested in me, his tone calm and reasonable, which somehow made it worse. He listed things in vague, sweeping terms: education, housing, support, as if I were a business expense that needed to start showing returns. My adoptive mother nodded along, her expression tight, saying that family helps family, that sacrifices are part of belonging, that this was a chance for me to show gratitude. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The message was clear and suffocating. If I refused, I wouldn't just be cheap or difficult, I would be ungrateful, disloyal, exposed. I felt my hands start to shake as the familiar panic crept in, my heart racing, my vision narrowing slightly around the edges. The restaurant felt too bright, too open, every nearby table suddenly a potential audience. I could already imagine the scene if I said no, my sister's laughter turning sharp, her voice rising just enough to draw attention, comments about how after everything they'd done, I still couldn't step up. I imagined waiters lingering, other diners glancing over, the story being rewritten on the spot so that I was once again the problem, the embarrassing one, the reminder that I didn't quite fit. They didn't need to spell it out. Years of conditioning did the work for them. The fear of another public humiliation, of being reduced to a spectacle again, pressed down on me until my options felt painfully limited. I was angry, but the anger had nowhere to go. I was hurt, but there was no room for that either. All that remained was the instinct to make it stop, to end the moment as quickly and quietly as possible, even if it meant hurting myself in the process. My grandmother looked like she might cry. She reached for my arm, her fingers brushing my sleeve in a tentative, almost apologetic gesture, but she didn't say anything. I don't blame her for that. She had spent her whole life navigating this family too, learning when to speak and when silence was the only way to survive. Still, the sadness in her eyes made my chest ache in a way the anger hadn't. She knew what I was about to do, and she knew why. I took a slow breath, though it didn't calm me the way breathing exercises are supposed to, and reached for my wallet with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The leather felt worn and thin under my fingers, a small, mundane detail that grounded me even as everything else felt unreal. Pulling out my card felt like surrender. I handed it to the waiter without meeting his eyes, my mouth dry, my ears ringing slightly as if I were underwater. The moment the card left my hand, the tension at the table eased. My sister leaned back, satisfied, already moving on to another conversation as if nothing significant had just happened. My adoptive parents relaxed, their expectations met, their narrative intact. The crisis, from their perspective, was over. No one thanked me. No one acknowledged the cost. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore, it was comfortable, because the imbalance had been restored. I sat there, staring at the table, my body still shaking, feeling hollowed out in a way that was both familiar and newly devastating. Paying that bill didn't make me feel generous or included. It made me feel small, used, and painfully aware of how far I was willing to go to avoid being shamed again. The humiliation hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape, turning inward, settling deep where no one else could see it. As we stood to leave and coats were collected, I felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion wash over me, the kind that comes not from one bad night, but from years of carrying the same weight. I had avoided another public scene, but the cost of that avoidance was now very real, reflected not just in my bank account, but in the quiet, undeniable understanding that this family's acceptance had always been conditional, and the conditions were never going to be fair. As they began planning another trip without me, their energy suddenly light and animated now that the uncomfortable part of the evening was behind them, I felt myself fading back into the background where they clearly preferred me. My sister pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos from some luxury resort she had been talking about for months, talking excitedly about how easy it would be to go again now that her schedule had opened up. My adoptive parents leaned in, discussing dates, flights, and hotels, casually mentioning how nice it would be to travel as a family, the word family used without a flicker of awareness that I was sitting right there, still reeling from what had just happened. No one looked at me. No one paused to consider whether I might be included or even informed. It was assumed, without discussion, that I wouldn't be going, just as it had always been assumed. Trips like that were for them, for real family, for people who fit neatly into their version of belonging. I sat there quietly, my hands folded in my lap, my card still gone, my chest tight, listening to them outline plans I would never be part of, feeling that familiar, dull resignation settle over me again. Then my grandmother stood up. The movement was sudden enough that it drew every eye to her immediately, chairs scraping softly against the floor as conversations faltered and died mid-sentence. She wasn't a loud woman by nature, and because of that, the silence that followed her standing carried an unexpected weight. She placed both hands on the table, steadying herself, her posture straighter than I had seen it in years, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. She said my sister's name first, firmly, without the softness she usually used, and then she addressed my adoptive parents, her gaze unwavering as she looked at each of them in turn. She said she had watched the entire evening unfold, that she had listened to the way they spoke to me, about me, and around me, and that she was ashamed of what she had seen. The word shame landed heavily, especially coming from her, because it wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was precise, like a verdict. The room felt frozen as she continued, reminding them that I had been a child when they adopted me, not a favor they had done themselves, not an investment meant to generate returns. She said that love was not something you charged interest on, and that if you constantly reminded someone of what you had given them, then you had never truly given it at all. Her voice didn't shake. If anything, it grew steadier with each sentence, fueled by a clarity that seemed to surprise everyone, including me. She spoke about the dinner, about how I had been humiliated in public, excluded, and then forced to pay for a celebration I wasn't allowed to be part of. She didn't soften her language. She called it cruel. She called it exploitative. She said that watching them pressure me into paying that bill had been one of the most disgraceful things she had witnessed in her own family. The word family, coming from her now, felt different, heavier, earned. My sister tried to laugh it off at first, making a dismissive comment about how sensitive everyone was being, but my grandmother cut her off instantly, raising her hand slightly, her eyes flashing with a warning I had never seen directed at her before. She said this was not a joke, and that if anyone at that table thought it was, then they needed to take a hard look at themselves. The laughter died completely. My adoptive parents sat stiffly, their expressions tight and stunned, clearly unprepared to be confronted like this, especially not by her. I sat there, barely breathing, my heart pounding in my ears, because I had spent my entire life waiting for someone to say out loud what I had only ever been allowed to feel in private. Hearing it spoken so clearly, so publicly, was overwhelming in a way I didn't know how to process. It wasn't triumph or relief exactly. It was something closer to disbelief, like watching a long-standing rule suddenly be broken without permission. My grandmother finished by saying that if this was how they treated someone they claimed as family, then she wanted no part in their celebrations or their trips, and that she would not sit quietly and watch it happen again. She looked directly at me then, her expression softening just enough to remind me that this had always been about me, not about proving a point. She told me, simply, that none of what had happened that night was my fault. The room remained silent after she sat back down, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Plans for the trip were forgotten. Phones were put away. No one seemed to know how to respond, because there was nothing to deflect with humor or money. Something fundamental had been exposed, and it couldn't be ignored anymore. I sat there, still shaking, but for the first time that night, the shaking wasn't just from fear or humiliation. It was from the sudden, startling realization that I hadn't imagined any of it, that the pain I had been carrying for so long had finally been seen, named, and defended, and that my grandmother's voice, steady and unyielding, had cut through years of silence in a way nothing else ever had. The room hadn't even fully recovered from the weight of what she had already said when my grandmother straightened in her chair again, and this time there was no hesitation at all in her movements, no uncertainty left to read between the lines. She didn't wait for permission, didn't glance around to gauge reactions, didn't soften her posture the way she usually did to keep the peace. She looked directly at my adoptive parents first, then at my sister, and finally at me, as if anchoring herself before delivering something she had clearly decided long before this night. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and devastating in its clarity, and she announced that she had rewritten her will. At first, I didn't fully understand what she meant, because wills had always been discussed in vague, distant terms in this family, something impolite to dwell on, something that existed somewhere in the future and never quite belonged to the present moment. My sister let out a small, incredulous laugh, the kind meant to dismiss what she assumed was an empty threat or an emotional exaggeration. My adoptive father shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, already preparing whatever argument he thought would shut this down. My grandmother didn't stop there. She clarified, slowly and deliberately, that she hadn't adjusted it, hadn't redistributed portions, hadn't used it as a tool to teach lessons in percentages. She said she was giving everything to me. The words hit harder than anything else that night, harder even than the public humiliation or the pressure or the money I had just lost, because they appended a lifetime of expectations in a single sentence. Everything went silent again, but this time it wasn't the stunned quiet of discomfort, it was the kind of silence that comes when a structure people relied on suddenly collapses. My sister's smile vanished completely, her face tightening as if she hadn't heard correctly. My adoptive mother's hand flew to her chest in an almost theatrical gesture of shock, while my adoptive father stood up halfway, then stopped, as if unsure whether anger or disbelief should come first. I sat there completely still, my mind struggling to catch up with reality, because for most of my life, inheritance had been something I never even allowed myself to consider. It was always assumed, implicitly and explicitly, that anything like that belonged to blood, to real family, to people who had always been centered and prioritized. I had grown up understanding that my role was to be grateful for what I was given in the present, not to expect anything from the future. Hearing my grandmother say those words felt unreal, like she was speaking into a space that had never been meant to exist for me. She didn't raise her voice when the protests started. My sister immediately demanded to know what that was supposed to mean, accusing her of being dramatic, of letting emotions cloud her judgment. My adoptive father spoke over her, insisting this wasn't appropriate, that family matters shouldn't be aired out like this, that decisions like that needed to be discussed rationally. My grandmother listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when they finally paused, she answered them with the same steady composure. She said it meant exactly what it sounded like. She said she was done rewarding cruelty with comfort and entitlement with silence. She said she had watched me be diminished, excluded, and used for years, and she refused to let that be the legacy she left behind. As she spoke, I felt a pressure building behind my eyes that I hadn't felt since childhood, the kind that comes from holding too much emotion in for too long. This wasn't about money. I knew that with an almost painful certainty. It was about being chosen without condition, without debt, without expectation of repayment. It was about someone looking at the entire history of how I had been treated and deciding, unequivocally, that it was wrong. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being tolerated or leveraged or reminded of my supposed luck. I was being defended. My grandmother said she had already taken care of the legal details, that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision born out of anger, but something she had thought about carefully and deliberately. She said she wanted to make sure that when she was gone, the person who had spent their life being made to feel like an outsider would finally have security that no one could take away or attach conditions to. She looked directly at my sister then and said that wealth meant nothing if it was built on the ability to hurt others without consequence. She looked at my adoptive parents and said that adoption was not charity and that love that keeps score is not love at all. The reaction around the table was immediate and volatile. My sister accused her of betrayal, of choosing me over her own flesh and blood, her voice rising despite the restaurant setting. My adoptive mother began to cry, insisting she had always tried her best, that things were being exaggerated, that this was unfair. My adoptive father's face hardened into something cold and calculating, and he said flatly that this would tear the family apart. My grandmother didn't flinch. She said the family had been tearing itself apart quietly for years, and that pretending otherwise hadn't saved anyone. I felt exposed in a way that was almost unbearable, sitting at the center of a decision that had nothing to do with my actions and everything to do with how others had treated me. I wanted to disappear and speak at the same time, to say something that acknowledged the magnitude of what she was doing without making it seem like I expected it or demanded it. My throat tightened, and no words came out. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. She reached over and placed her hand over mine, her grip warm and firm, grounding me in the middle of the chaos she had just unleashed. She told me, quietly but clearly, that I didn't owe her anything for this, not gratitude, not loyalty, not forgiveness toward anyone else. She said this wasn't a reward and it wasn't a weapon. It was simply her choice. Hearing that broke something open inside me that I hadn't known was still sealed shut. For so long, every act of kindness in my life had come with strings attached, visible or not. This was different. This was final and unconditional. The argument continued around us, voices overlapping, emotions spiraling, but I felt strangely detached from it, as if I were watching it from a distance. Something fundamental had shifted, and no amount of outrage or guilt-tripping could undo that. The narrative I had been fed since I was 4 years old, that I was lucky to be chosen, lucky to be kept, lucky to be tolerated, cracked under the weight of a single, undeniable truth. Someone in this family had seen me clearly and chosen me anyway. When we finally stood to leave, the atmosphere was fractured beyond repair, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. As we walked out together, my grandmother's arm linked through mine. I felt a mix of shock, grief, and something unfamiliar that I struggled to name. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was the quiet, overwhelming realization that for the first time in my life, belonging hadn't been something I had to earn, and that knowledge settled into me with a gravity that made it impossible to ever go back to who I had been before that moment. The table exploded in a way that felt inevitable the second my grandmother's words fully sank in, like a pressure valve finally giving out after years of being sealed too tight. Voices rose all at once, overlapping and jagged, accusations hurled so quickly they barely had time to land before another replaced them. The careful, polished veneer my family wore in public shattered completely, revealing something raw, ugly, and desperate underneath. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as people leaned forward or stood halfway up, hands gesturing sharply, faces flushed with anger and disbelief. My adoptive parents turned on me almost immediately, as if an unspoken agreement had already been made that this had to be my fault. My adoptive father pointed at me across the table, his voice shaking with fury as he accused me of manipulating my grandmother, of playing the victim behind closed doors, of feeding her lies to turn her against her own family. He said I had always been good at that, at making myself look helpless, at exploiting sympathy to get what I wanted. Hearing those words felt surreal, because I had spent most of my life doing the exact opposite, minimizing my pain, staying silent, trying desperately not to be a burden or a problem. My adoptive mother sobbed openly now, her earlier composure completely gone, insisting that she had given me everything, that she had loved me in her own way, that this was the thanks she got. She kept repeating that she had taken me in when no one else would have, that she had saved me, as if my existence before them had been some kind of moral failing on my part. Each sentence carried the same underlying message I had heard my entire life, that my place in this family was conditional, revocable, and dependent on perpetual gratitude. The difference now was that they were saying it out loud, without any attempt to disguise it. My sister was the loudest of all. She stood up fully, knocking her chair back hard enough that it nearly tipped over, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. She screamed that I wasn't real family, the words sharp and piercing, cutting through the noise like glass. She said blood mattered, that it always had, that no piece of paper or sentimental speech could change reality. She accused my grandmother of abandoning her own flesh and blood for a stranger, and then turned back to me, her voice rising even higher as she demanded to know how long I had been planning this, how long I had been working to steal what wasn't mine. I sat there, frozen again, but this time the paralysis felt different. It wasn't shock so much as a strange, hollow clarity. Every accusation they threw at me sounded less like a revelation and more like a confession of how they had always seen me. A manipulator. An outsider. A threat. The irony was suffocating. I hadn't asked for anything. I hadn't even known this was coming. Yet the moment something was taken away from them, something they felt entitled to, I became the villain in their story without hesitation. My grandmother tried to speak, raising her voice for the first time that night, but they talked over her, dismissing her words as the product of age, of confusion, of being emotionally compromised. My adoptive father suggested she wasn't in her right mind, that decisions like this proved it. Hearing him question her competence, after years of praising her wisdom when it suited him, made my stomach churn. It was clear now that respect, like affection, had always been conditional in this family, offered only when it reinforced their sense of control. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to shout back that I had never manipulated anyone, that I had spent my life doing everything possible to avoid conflict, that the idea of orchestrating something like this was absurd. But every time I opened my mouth, another accusation slammed into the space, leaving no room for my voice. And slowly, I realized something else. Even if I did speak, it wouldn't matter. They weren't interested in the truth. They needed a reason, any reason, that allowed them to avoid looking at their own behavior. My sister kept repeating that I wasn't real family, her voice cracking with fury, and for the first time, instead of feeling crushed by those words, I felt a dull, aching confirmation. This was the belief that had shaped every interaction, every slight, every exclusion. This was why it had been so easy for them to humiliate me, to pressure me, to use me. I had never been one of them in their eyes, no matter how long I stayed or how much I gave. Hearing it screamed so openly hurt, but it also stripped away the last remnants of illusion. Around us, the restaurant had gone quiet. I could feel eyes on our table, see waiters hovering at a distance, unsure whether to intervene. The luxury setting only made the scene more grotesque, the white tablecloth stained now not with food or wine, but with years of resentment spilling out all at once. I felt exposed, like my entire life had been dragged into the open for strangers to witness, yet beneath that humiliation was something steadier beginning to form. My grandmother finally managed to stand again, her movement sharp and decisive, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the chaos with unmistakable authority. She told them to stop. She said their reaction was proving her point more effectively than anything she could have said herself. She told them that if their first instinct was to accuse and attack instead of reflect, then that was on them, not on me. She said she had made her decision with clear eyes and a clear mind, and that no amount of yelling would change it. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break under their words. Instead, I sat there, listening, absorbing, finally understanding that this explosion wasn't a sudden disaster, but the inevitable result of years of unspoken cruelty finally being challenged. They weren't angry because they had been wronged. They were angry because the story they told themselves about who they were, and who I was, had just been exposed. As the accusations continued to fly, one truth became impossible to ignore. The moment my grandmother chose me openly, the family I had been trying so desperately to belong to showed me exactly why I never truly had. The shouting hadn't even fully settled when my grandmother spoke again, and this time there was something in her tone that made everyone stop almost immediately, not because she was louder than them, but because her voice carried a finality that cut through the chaos more effectively than anger ever could. She said there was something else they needed to hear, something they had clearly hoped would never come out, and as she spoke, I felt a strange tightening in my chest, a sense that whatever came next was going to change the shape of everything I thought I knew about my life. She revealed that when I was adopted, my biological family hadn't simply disappeared into obscurity the way I had always been told. Instead, arrangements had been made quietly, deliberately, and legally. A large trust had been set up specifically for my care, meant to cover my education, living expenses, therapy, and future security, a safeguard to ensure that I would be protected no matter what kind of home I ended up in. That trust, she said, had been given to my adoptive parents with the explicit understanding that it would be used for me, for my well-being, and for nothing else. The room felt like it tilted. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, each beat echoing the same stunned question over and over. Paid. The word alone reshaped decades of memory in an instant. I had grown up believing I was a financial burden, a charity case, someone who should be endlessly grateful for the resources spent on me, and now my grandmother was calmly explaining that not only had those resources existed independently of my adoptive parents, but that they had never truly belonged to them at all. She didn't rush her explanation. She laid it out methodically, as if she knew that every detail mattered. She said the trust had been substantial, far more than what most families would ever need to raise a child comfortably, and that it had been intended to remove any excuse for resentment or imbalance. There was supposed to be transparency, oversight, and periodic accounting. Instead, she said, the money had quietly vanished over the years, siphoned off for renovations, vacations, luxury cars, private schools for their biological children, and lifestyle upgrades that had nothing to do with me. My adoptive father tried to interrupt her, his face draining of color as he insisted she was misrepresenting things, but she shut him down instantly, telling him not to insult her intelligence. She said she had seen the records herself, had asked questions when numbers didn't add up, and had been fed excuses and deflections for years. She said she had stayed silent longer than she should have because she wanted to believe the best of them, because she hoped things would change, because she feared what the truth would mean for me if it came out too soon. I felt sick. Memories flooded my mind all at once, moments I had never questioned because I hadn't known there was anything to question. Being told money was tight when I needed therapy. Being discouraged from certain extracurriculars because they were too expensive. Being reminded constantly of how much I cost them. All of it twisted into something unrecognizable under this new light. I hadn't been a burden. I had been profitable. My grandmother said that while I was being reminded to be grateful, while I was being made to feel like an obligation, they were using funds meant for my future to build theirs. She said the cruelty of it wasn't just financial, it was psychological, because it required them to maintain a narrative where I was dependent and indebted, even as they benefited from money that was never theirs to begin with. Her voice wavered for the first time then, not with uncertainty, but with anger that had clearly been held back for far too long. My sister exploded again, shouting that this was a lie, that none of it made sense, that she would have known if something like that were true. My grandmother turned to her and said quietly that children aren't usually told when the adults around them are doing something wrong, especially when telling them would raise questions that no one wants to answer. She said that benefiting from something doesn't mean you understand where it came from, and that ignorance doesn't erase responsibility. I sat there, numb, staring at the table as if it might anchor me to reality, because my sense of self was unraveling in real time. The shame I had carried for years suddenly had nowhere to live. It didn't belong to me anymore. It never had. Every lecture about gratitude, every reminder of how lucky I was, every implication that I should be thankful just to be there had been built on a lie so fundamental it made my hands shake. My adoptive mother broke down completely then, crying and insisting they had done what they thought was best, that raising children was expensive, that families share resources. My grandmother responded with a quiet, devastating calm, saying that families don't steal from children in their care and then punish them for existing. She said that love doesn't require someone to be diminished so others can feel justified. The restaurant felt unbearably small, like the walls were closing in as the truth settled over the table. I became aware of how exposed my life suddenly was, how every slight and every humiliation now had a financial shadow attached to it. They hadn't just emotionally neglected me. They had benefited from my presence while making me feel like I was the one taking too much. I finally understood why my grandmother had rewritten her will, why she had done it without hesitation or apology. This wasn't favoritism. It was correction. It was her attempt to balance something that had been wrong from the beginning, to ensure that at least one part of my story ended with accountability instead of silence. As she finished speaking, there was nothing left for anyone to say. The accusations that had filled the air moments earlier collapsed under the weight of documented truth. I sat there, shaking, not with fear this time, but with the overwhelming realization that the narrative I had built my entire identity around had been false. I hadn't been adopted out of pure generosity. I had been placed into a system that paid well and treated me poorly, and the people who were supposed to protect me had chosen themselves every single time. In that moment, the pain was immense, but it was also clarifying. The shame that had followed me since childhood finally loosened its grip, replaced by a cold, steady understanding. What had been done to me wasn't my fault, and it never had been. She didn't stop there, and by that point I realized she had never intended to. My grandmother reached into her bag with deliberate calm and pulled out a thick folder, the kind that looks heavy not just because of paper, but because of what it contains. She placed it on the table slowly, flattening her palm on top of it as if grounding herself, and said that what she had spoken about so far was only the beginning. She said she had kept records for years, not out of spite, but out of necessity, because every time something felt wrong, every time I was dismissed or blamed or shamed, she wrote it down, gathered statements, kept copies, asked questions, and refused to let her concerns disappear into polite family silence. She began listing things I barely remembered as abuse because they had been normalized so thoroughly in my life. Instances where I had been denied medical or psychological care that the trust explicitly covered. Emails and letters where requests for funds for my needs were rejected while luxury purchases were approved weeks later. Notes from teachers and counselors who had raised concerns about my emotional state, only to be told by my parents that I was dramatic, difficult, or attention-seeking. Financial records showing trust money redirected into accounts tied to renovations, tuition for my sister, family vacations I hadn't been invited on, and investments that had nothing to do with raising a child. With every sentence, my sense of reality shifted further. Things I had internalized as personal failures suddenly had context. Moments where I had been told I was too expensive, too needy, too much, were reframed as deliberate choices to withhold care while benefiting from resources meant for me. My grandmother said the word abuse out loud, clearly, and without hesitation, and hearing it applied to my childhood felt disorienting and terrifying, but also painfully accurate. She said neglect wasn't always loud or violent, that sometimes it looked like emotional starvation paired with financial exploitation, and that calling it anything else only protected the people who caused it. My adoptive father tried again to interrupt, his voice breaking as he accused her of exaggeration, of misinterpreting documents, of trying to destroy the family, but she cut him off by sliding copies of statements across the table, dates highlighted, signatures visible. She said she had already consulted professionals, auditors, and attorneys, and that nothing she was saying was based on suspicion or emotion. It was documented. It was verifiable. It was real. The color drained from his face as he realized this wasn't a conversation he could talk his way out of. Then, without raising her voice or asking permission, she took out her phone and called her lawyer. She put the call on speaker, her voice steady as she explained where she was and what she needed done. She instructed him to proceed exactly as discussed, to finalize the changes, to lock everything in immediately, to initiate the next steps regarding the trust and the misuse of funds. Hearing legal language enter the space made everything suddenly irreversible. This wasn't a family argument anymore. This was accountability. My sister completely lost control at that point. She screamed that this was insane, that my grandmother was ruining everything, that I was destroying the family, her voice cracking as she paced, hands in her hair, drawing attention from every corner of the restaurant. She accused me of stealing her future, of poisoning my grandmother against everyone else, of lying my entire life just to take what wasn't mine. Her breakdown was raw and chaotic, tears streaking her face as she shouted insults and accusations without direction or restraint. People were staring openly now. Waiters hovered nervously. Someone at another table whispered something I couldn't make out. I sat there in stunned silence, my body shaking uncontrollably, not from fear of her, but from the sheer overload of everything crashing together at once. My childhood. The lies. The money. The humiliation. The validation. It felt like my nervous system couldn't decide whether to collapse or finally exhale. I didn't respond to my sister. I couldn't. Nothing I said would have mattered anyway. She wasn't reacting to me. She was reacting to the sudden loss of entitlement she had never questioned before. Security arrived quickly, 2 men in dark suits who approached with practiced calm and firm authority. They asked my sister to lower her voice, then asked her to step away from the table. She resisted, shouting louder, accusing them of taking sides, of protecting criminals, of humiliating her, until they had no choice but to physically guide her away. Watching her be escorted out, still yelling my name like it was a curse, was surreal. For years, I had been the one quietly removed, emotionally sidelined, made invisible. Now the disruption was no longer me. My adoptive parents sat frozen, stunned into silence, their earlier outrage replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. My grandmother remained seated, composed, her hand still resting on the folder, as if anchoring the truth in place. When the lawyer confirmed everything was set in motion, she thanked him calmly and ended the call. Only then did she finally turn to me again. She didn't apologize, because she knew this wasn't something an apology could fix. Instead, she told me that none of this defined me, that what had been done to me did not diminish my worth or my identity, and that the truth, as painful as it was also the beginning of something honest. Her voice softened then, but it didn't weaken. It carried certainty, the kind that doesn't ask to be believed. As the restaurant slowly returned to its low hum, I sat there trying to process the fact that my life had just been split cleanly into before and after. The illusion was gone. The lies were exposed. The silence that had protected abuse for decades had been shattered publicly and permanently. I felt raw, shaken, and exhausted beyond words, but beneath all of that was a strange, unfamiliar steadiness. For the first time in my life, the truth had been spoken without being immediately buried, and no matter what came next, I knew with absolute clarity that I was no longer carrying their shame for them. I left the restaurant slowly, not because anyone stopped me, but because my body needed time to catch up with everything that had just happened, every step feeling heavy and unreal as if I were walking out of a place where gravity worked differently. The noise behind me had dulled into an indistinct murmur, voices and movement fading as the door closed, sealing off the chaos, the accusations, the years of denial that had finally collapsed under their own weight. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, biting against my flushed skin, grounding me in a way nothing inside that restaurant ever had. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, that I had lost my family forever in that room. Not just the version of them I had clung to out of hope or obligation, but the real ones, the people who had shown me exactly who they were when their comfort and entitlement were threatened. There would be no quiet reconciliation after this, no awkward apologies smoothed over by time, no pretending that things could go back to the way they were. Whatever fragile thread had kept us connected had finally snapped, and strangely, I felt more clarity than grief about it. As I stood there on the sidewalk, the city lights blurring slightly as my eyes burned, memories washed over me in fragments rather than scenes. Being 4 years old and told to smile because I was lucky. Sitting at dinner tables where my presence felt tolerated at best. Apologizing for needs I didn't understand were normal. Shrinking myself so others wouldn't feel inconvenienced by my existence. carrying a quiet, constant fear that if I asked for too much, or needed too much, or simply was too much, I would be reminded that I was replaceable. That fear had shaped every decision I made for as long as I could remember. For years, I had accepted the label of unwanted without ever consciously choosing it, because it had been reinforced in so many subtle ways that it felt like a fact rather than a wound. I was the adopted one. The extra. The obligation. The one who should be grateful for whatever scraps of affection were offered and never ask for more. I had internalized that role so deeply that I didn't even realize how much it had cost me, how much of myself I had given up just to survive in a space that was never safe. Tonight tore that identity apart. The loss was real, and I didn't minimize it. Losing a family, even one that hurt you, leaves a hollow space that doesn't immediately fill with relief or freedom. It leaves questions, grief for what should have been, and a strange mourning for the version of yourself that kept trying long after it should have stopped. I felt that grief settle into me as I walked, a quiet ache that acknowledged how badly I had wanted things to be different, how long I had waited for love that never came. But layered beneath that grief was something else, something entirely new and unfamiliar, a steadiness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. For the first time in my life, the story I had been told about myself no longer matched reality. I wasn't the unwanted adopted girl who should feel lucky to be tolerated. That version of me had been constructed by people who needed me small so they could feel justified, comfortable, and unchallenged. And tonight, that construction had finally collapsed. My grandmother had chosen me openly, publicly, and without condition. Not as a consolation prize. Not as a moral lesson. Not as a weapon against anyone else. She had chosen me because she saw the truth of what had been done to me and refused to let it stand uncorrected. She had chosen me with intention, clarity, and courage, and that choice rewrote something fundamental inside me. Being chosen like that didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. It told me that the neglect, the cruelty, the exploitation were not reflections of my worth, but of theirs. It told me that love wasn't something I had failed to earn, but something that had been deliberately withheld. And it told me that I was never asking for too much, I was just asking the wrong people. As I walked away from the restaurant, I realized I wasn't leaving empty-handed, even though it felt like I had lost everything familiar. I was leaving with the truth, with my dignity intact, and with the knowledge that at least one person had seen me clearly from the beginning and chosen to stand beside me when it mattered most. That knowledge settled into me quietly, not as triumph or victory, but as something far more powerful, a sense of legitimacy I had never been allowed to claim before. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel saved. I felt real. For the first time in my life, I wasn't defined by my adoption, by my supposed debt, or by someone else's version of family. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't tolerated. I wasn't a burden or an obligation. I was a person who had been wronged and finally believed. A person who had been chosen not out of pity or convenience, but out of truth. And as I disappeared into the night, leaving that chapter behind me forever, I understood something with absolute clarity. I had lost the family that never truly wanted me, but I had gained something I had been searching for my entire life, the certainty that my existence was not a mistake, and that being chosen, even once, was enough to finally let go of the lie that I had ever been unwanted at all.